Terrific. Okay, I declare this hearing of the Senate Select Committee on Intergenerational Housing Inequality open, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who might appear here today. The committee will be conducting today's hearing in person and remotely. Committee members participating include myself, Senator Pocock as chair, and joining remotely is Senator Brown and Senator Bragg. These are public proceedings being video streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they're protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to the committee, and such action may be treated as a contempt. It's also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses have a right also to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground on which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. I also remind witnesses who are appearing via video conference and who are not speaking to mute their microphones. So I'm just going to check that our systems are working before we proceed, Mr. Tui. Shall I just suspend for a moment while we... We're all right? Proceed? Oh, wait.
Sure. Yep.
We're just sorting a small technical detail here for a second, and we're ready to roll. Thank you. I now welcome Mr. Jack Tui. I understand the information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to committees has been provided to you. Is that right? Great. For the Hansard record, could you please give us your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
My name is Jack Glenn Tui, and I am an author and activist, probably most known for my housing activism.
Great. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here in person, Mr. Tui. It's great to have you. I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Thank you, Chair. In 2023, I went pretty crazy viral for a housing crisis video that compared the wage to house price ratio of 2023 and 1983. And I think the reason it went really viral is it really simplified something that can feel very complex. A massive housing system with trillions of dollars in it and millions of people in it can feel very nebulous, I think, to the average punter. And it really just simply outlines that in 1983, house prices were about 3 times your wage, and in 2023 it was about 10 times. So one of the most common comments that I got as a result of this video is it gave people language to speak something that they felt intrinsically but couldn't really articulate in a way that they to their parents or other family members. And it made something that was, yeah, as I say, very intrinsic. We could feel that we were getting shut out of the housing market, but we didn't necessarily have the simple facts in front of us to make that case to our parents or our grandparents or just the broader society. And the other common thing that came through was this sense that people were saying, thank you for giving me a reason not to feel like a failure. And I think something that I'd love to speak about today is the cultural implications of the housing crisis and shutting people out of the housing market, considering our cultural obsession with home ownership. So many of our great dramas on TVs and sitcoms centred around cul-de-sacs and neighbourhoods, and the idea of the Australian dream has been one that we continue to sell to future generations of Australians, but can also continue to make it harder and harder to reach. So there's a disconnect there where people feel like it's a personal failure not being able to afford a house rather than a systemic one.
Can I just pause you there for a moment, because I know there are a lot of people who want to see you and what you're saying, and so we are okay now. We are and audio as well. Great. So I want to go back and hear again a little more about what you're saying. When you did that video that went viral, what do you think people were responding to? And feel free to recap what you've just said.
I think people were really responding to this idea that they could feel that they were shut out from the housing market. They had that intrinsic understanding that they couldn't afford housing, but they didn't necessarily have the simple numbers in front of them to make that case to their family and friends and to the broader society that in our Australian culture, or I guess pretty much every neoliberal economy, we really put a lot of stock into owning housing stock as the primary means of wealth, and until you have a home of your own, you're not considered to be a successful member of society. And a lot of our cultural stories from Neighbours and Home and Away, even now to Bluey, centre around having these homes and cul-de-sacs and neighbourhoods that people come and go and invite their neighbours over, and it's centred around home ownership. And I think that the video very simply put to people, or really articulated in a way that people couldn't prior, that it was not a personal failure. The system had changed from where it was 3 times your wage to buy a house to 10 times your wage to buy a house, and it continues to grow. And so people were able to share that with their mum or their dad or the grandparents or someone else in their life, and say, see, like, I'm not crazy. It is different now. And I think that's why it just was catapulted to millions of people, both in Australia but around the world.
And do you think that was because it was a simple way of communicating and understanding it, and also because it kind of cracked that notion of shame or failure?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think the shame that people carry as a result of this cultural notion that we have to be a successful member of society, to have stability in society, is to own a home. And so when each generation, each year, more and more people are locked out of that, more and more people feel that they are not able to be successful. And so that can have a lifelong effect, I think. That's before we even talk about the problems of the rental market and the way that renters are treated. But I think this idea that people could get the shame, they could shift from a personal one to a systemic shame, and then I was able to bring people along on a journey of more detail to retrace our steps to how we got to where we are, and then try and find some of the solutions as well.
So you mentioned one of the important cultural memes or whatever, or central myths or realities of Australian society is that a home really matters, and that we live in cul-de-sac communities in our kind of cultural stories, but that's denied to your viewers and people who support you. Is that what you...
Yeah.
Why is that so important?
Well, not to get to a spoiler at the end of the book, but community, I think, is the solution to most of our problems. And I think the lack of community and the dissolution of community is the reason why, and this trend towards individualism over the last kind of 40 or 50 years has been the thing that has started to fracture our society. And so people long for that. People long to be like Toadie, Rebecca and Neighbours, and going over to your neighbour to get a some sugar or whatever. Like, that's a thing that's been quite lost. And I think part of that reason is, A, we can't afford to live in these brick homes in the cul-de-sac that nothing special, but from an architectural perspective, but very special from a cultural makeup perspective. And then on the other side of that, then as renters, because we're not granted anything longer than a year-long lease, we're not guaranteed to be in any one place for more than a year, and it's much harder for us to make those community connections with our neighbours, to invite people around for a barbecue, because we're worried that another neighbour might give us complain about noise or things like this. And there's just this idea that communing together and having this neighbourhood sense of looking out for each other and being there for each other has been just completely lost. It is, and ultimately ends up a thing of fiction. Neighbours not even on TV anymore, so we don't even get to escape to Ramsay Street. So
So the experience of being priced out of home ownership and the experience of renting has cracked open that myth for a generation from the way people have responded to. If you're going to summarise the kind of responses you got from your generation and younger people to what you've been saying, what would you say? How do they feel?
It's a hard question to answer because really, like, the prevailing thing that people said to me at the time that was, like, you know, in the cultural zeitgeist was thank you, which was something that was very strange for me because I had, you know, I'd never in my life before had people been coming up to me in the street. Like, I'd never had that level of recognition before, and people were coming up to thank me for the video. And I think that like is a really important thing to unpack because people were desperate for some kind of champion in this space because they hadn't seen themselves in the conversation, I think. I think there was this sense that maybe this could be a turning point in the national conversation. I'm not sure that it was. I think things have continued on the same path for the most part. So, but I would say that it is really just coming back to that sense of failure, that sense of being locked out of something that were promised, and that I don't think is even an anger anymore. I think it's a sadness. I think that people are grieving that future, and I think that has a incalculable harm on the way that Australia operates.
Can you say some more about the generational nature of that and a little more about what you're hearing people are saying about that sadness and that loss?
Well, there's conversations around whether we can afford to even have kids. And, you know, there's also climate change built into that as well. But this idea that we were promised that if we go study at school and go to university and get a good job and work hard, that we'll have our white picket fence and we'll have our dog and we can have our 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 kids. I don't know if it's very affordable to have 10 kids, that's for sure. And so I think that is something that you start realising. For me, I probably realised in my late teens that I was getting shut out of the housing market, and the housing market that my parents were able to buy into as 2 people from the Central Coast moving down to Sydney was very different than it was for me. Even with that kind of generational wealth attached to me. But when I think about that generational wealth and that promise that when my parents leave this earth in their 90s and I'm in my 60s, that me and my brother will share the spoils of the housing crisis, then it's like too late, right? And also it's split and it's divisible and we've still got to buy in an inflated housing market. So the generational thing is, it is this sense that we've done everything right. I mean, I didn't go to university, but, you know, most people did everything right and still are not given what they're promised. And I think that, as I said before, like, that has a real deep impact on how we relate to each other in a society if we can't fulfil the promises of what Australia is meant to be.
And you've referred to a kind of shift over the 3 years that you've been engaging through social media on this issue, a movement from thank you, you've named it, it's helpful to hear you describe my situation, so a sharing of experience now into a different moment. How would you describe that trajectory over recent years?
We're definitely in a different space now, and I think the conversation around the housing crisis has bubbled to the surface, and it is something that is often spoken about on the news or in Parliament. I'm not sure that any of the real solutions are often spoken about in those spaces. I think that there is a severe degree of scapegoating going on and blaming immigration for a problem that immigration didn't cause. And, you know, in my book and in my research, you can look at every decade for the last 4 decades. Our housing stock as a percentage has grown faster than our population has grown. And so if everyone in the 1980s was housed equitably, which is not the case, but it was a much more fair housing system than we have today at the end of the kind of post-war consensus before neoliberalism came in and stuffed everything up, if we can take that as our baseline and say that everyone was housed and it was a fair, equitable housing market, it only took 3 times your salary to afford a house. It only take you a couple of years to save up for the deposit, and then you're in your own home. Then if we're adding more as a percentage decade on decade, more housing than we are, our population is growing, largely from immigration, then we've created more supply than we've created demand. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't stop this supply and demand conversation happening, where we blame the newest Australians coming in here, which take years and years and years and years and years to be able to afford a house. They live in far denser housing than a longer term Australian, someone who's been here for generations or grown up in Australia, and we're blaming these people for something that is structural, and it's something that is cultural. It's this idea that we believe the house prices will go up, and we need house prices to go up, so they do. And that is the problem. We have to change the cultural perception around whether we want house prices to double in value every 10 years, and if that's sustainable. And if we do, if that is what we want, we should probably also have wages doubling every 10 years, which we do not have.
No. And turning to renting, what's your thinking about what we need to do to ensure that renting, which is of course is now a longer experience, very high rents and hard to get a rental at present, what's your thinking about what we need to do about those third of Australians who are renting?
I can give you a capitalist answer and I can give you a socialist answer. The capitalist answer is that we should treat rental properties the same as we treat commercial leases. And basically, in a commercial lease, you're signing 3 to 6 year leases. The increase is capped to CPI, and you can do whatever the hell you want within the bounds of the building. You can erect a wall, you can knock a wall down, you can drill things into the walls. As long as you're not changing anything structural to the building, you can make of it what you will. And the landlord understands that that's the relationship, and ultimately you're probably increasing the value of their property if you're making improvements to the internal structures of the building. So in my experience, having been a business owner and having leased rental commercial spaces, I've definitely increased the value of those buildings. I've made them, I've removed all manner of decay and built walls that made way more sense for the building, and tore up moldy carpet and built decks on the roof and increased the value of the owners, and they loved me for it. And so I think that relationship, if we were going to borrow that from like an intensely capitalistic kind of relationship that seems to work under the bounds of capitalism, that's business, baby. Why can't we apply that to the rental market and treat it as a mutually beneficial situation where someone is paying rent, and as long as they're paying rent, they can do anything they like to the internals of that property, and they can stay as long as they continue to pay rent. I'd love to see longer term leases, and I'd love to see rules like that. I would love to paint the walls of my apartment because they're kind of like a spew beige, and it's not the best colour.
Just before I hand over to Senator Brown, is there anything you'd like to say about what we need to do in the housing market for home purchasing, that side of things?
Well, I think these are two sides of the same coin. I think that we need to make investing in housing an unattractive mode of wealth accumulation. I think we need to make it more difficult. We need to make it a symbiotic relationship in the rental market, which means that we have to have really strict rules around what the minimum standards are, and we need to just, as we've kind of started to go down this path with CGT and negative gearing, we need to make it not seem like a safe place to put your money. And we should be encouraging people to invest in innovation, where there are higher returns and a better net result for Australia when we invest in innovation and in medicine and in sciences and in environmental projects, renewable energy projects. We see a return on that investment. The individual investor sees a higher return on in that investment year on year, and they're making our country more prosperous in the process, rather than basically taking from the poorer Australians to give to the rich Australians, which is the economy that we have today.
Thanks so much for your answers there. And I'll come to Senator Brown for Deputy Chair for questions.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Tui, for coming along today and giving some evidence. Now, earlier in your contribution, you did drop out a couple of times for me, so forgive me if you've responded to these questions from the Chair. But you talked about in the beginning around the cost of housing compared, I think you talked about 1983 to 2023. So I was interested whether you could just go into a bit more detail about what you see as the biggest drivers of intergenerational housing inequality in Australia today, and what factors over that period of time have you seen?
Yeah, so I think I touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think the main driver of this has been a cultural change, that we've all bought into this idea that house prices will continue to go up forever, and we've decided that as a society that they should go up forever, and that means that people feel that the best place for them to accumulate wealth is in that housing market. But ultimately the effect of that is creating a Ponzi scheme where the people that have been invested for 4 decades need people to invest this year into the housing market for them to see their return on that investment. So they only see that return on that investment if they downsize or they are property developers or investors. So I think that's a big one. It's just the cultural notion that we all believe that this is the way that the housing market is meant to be run, and therefore as a younger person it still seems like a good idea to put our money into housing, because if we don't, every year that we don't do that, it gets more expensive and it gets harder to get into. So I think that then, like the thing that happened in tandem with this cultural shift is that there were policy changes that around capital gains tax discount coalescing with negative gearing in 1999, 2000, where we can see that house prices and wages completely became untethered. And that was because it threw petrol on the fire of this notion that that's a really great way to make money, because it was a good way of protecting your money. You weren't losing money in your bank account just with inflation, and your purchasing power you weren't losing because the money in your bank was, because of the housing market, inflating faster than CPI. And so also it was a good way of reducing the amount of tax we paid. But the other thing that happened, I think, is that we stopped investing in public housing, and we stopped seeing, and it all really comes to the same cultural notion that housing should be this private market where it's every person for themselves, not a service, an essential service that makes a country thrive, and we don't treat it the same way that we treat education or health. We are trying to treat education and health in a similar way that we have done for housing, but we're still a little bit less further down the path. I think now it's about 2.4% of all housing is public housing. There's an ever-growing public housing wait list, which consists of people fleeing domestic violence. It consists of people who are disabled and desperately need safe and secure housing, and every year more people like them join the list and less houses are built for people like them. And so we exist in a society where only 2.4 or whatever % of the population is able to have that refuge, while 30% of the country is able to find 60% of the country is able to go to a public school or find a public bed. And I think we look to places like America, where we look at their healthcare system and go, we would never want to be like them. They've over-privatized that industry, and now it means that you can go bankrupt if you break your arm. And we almost laugh at that in a kind of more morbid way. But also, we can see the stats there is that their life outcomes are worse. They live 5 years on average shorter than Australians do, and they spend twice as much money on healthcare in America than they do in Australia from the public purse. So it doesn't work. But we've applied that to the housing crisis, and then we all scratch our head and we put inquiries together to figure out what happened. Well, it's probably because from a federal perspective, the federal governments successively over the last 4 decades have just decided to vacate the field and their involvement in housing Australians. So I think that we should be building more public housing for all sorts of people, not just people that are the most needy, but people who build things, people who care for people in hospitals, people who teach the future generations. If they can't afford to live near their schools and hospitals and work sites, then what are we doing? Society ceases to be able to function, I think.
Thank you for that. Now, you did touch on in that response about governments vacating the field, but you're saying you're not seeing any difference in how housing is treated at the Commonwealth level today compared to, say, I think you referenced when the capital gains tax came in and negative gearing came in the 1990s. So, are you seeing? How housing is treated at the Commonwealth level today compared to, say, 5-10 years ago?
I would say that we are tracking in the right direction. However, as common with the current Labor government, it is slower than needed. I think it is putting band-aids on bullet holes rather than treating the crisis with the respect that a crisis deserves. And I think that has been what I'm seeing. I think that I had a lot of hope when the Albanese government was elected that there would be a lot of sweeping reform to climate and to housing and to social issues. And I have seen kind of tempered responses and a government that kind of gets it has to be pushed into making these concessions, and it takes, rather than being bold and brave and making the decisions that will benefit most Australians, because I think that this government is scared of headlines more than they're scared of the voter base. No offence.
Look, you're here to give your evidence, Mr. Tui, and I appreciate you coming along, but the government has put together a pretty comprehensive brief in terms of housing initiatives and funding over all sectors, including renters, social housing, affordable housing. But you're not here to listen to me reel off the government's the government's initiatives. I'm here to listen to your views. So what I did want to ask you, though, is how do you think the states are playing in this area as well?
Yeah.
Have you done some work on that?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting part of the conversation, is that I do feel that there can be a level of buck shifting between federal, state and local governments and who carries the most responsibility. And what I would love to see is a lot more widespread a coalition of state governments and federal governments to fix this problem. I think that in the debates around the rental crisis particularly, we see that the buck being passed from the federal government to states, saying, well, the federal government can't do anything about freezing rents, for example, because that's a state issue. But, we see National Cabinet get convened and solutions at a state and federal level be ironed out. We've seen that through COVID, and I think that's another frustration that people are feeling today, is that we have seen governments be effective. We've seen governments enact sweeping social policies that benefited a vast majority of Australians, with things like the job seeker or job keeper been doubled from the job seeker rate, which is in effect an admission that the job seeker rate is far too little, but maybe that's not for this inquiry. I think that we need a whole of government, whole of Australia focus on fixing this problem, and it has to be based on the average Australian, not special interest. We cannot be influenced by industries who profit. We cannot be listening to the banks and to massive property developers and powerful investors that are buying up homes that otherwise would be going to young, hardworking Australian families. We need to be listening to those families and what they need. And I think that at a state level, I think the states do have a lot of power to fix this problem, particularly in the rental crisis. I think the fastest way to solve the housing crisis is to solve the rental crisis. Because if I'm able to go home and change the colour of my spew walls and know that I'm going to be there for another 5 years, then I will invest in my neighbours, I will invest in my community, I will set up shop, and I will stimulate that economy and I will stimulate that community. But I don't have that guarantee. I have 9 months left on my lease and I don't know where I'll be after that. And so we can fix that in a matter of days. With the swipe of a pen, we can change the way that the rental laws work in every state and territory in this country. But if only there was this, this broader body that had this power to influence those states. Oh yeah, that's the federal government. So I feel like that's the federal government needs to bring something to the table to all states and really champion the everyday punter to convince each state in their different makeup and their different political persuasions and territories to enact something that is unified across the country in terms of minimum standards, minimum lease lengths, and the way that rent increases can be enacted. Again, I would love to see something like the commercial real estate being capped to CPI in most leases. I would love to see that capped here for tenant leases on the residential side. So, I think the states have a lot to do in this conversation, and I think the federal government has outsized power to influence those states.
So, do you support the National Housing Accord?
Can you elaborate on what's in the National Housing Accord, please?
Oh, sorry. So the National Housing Accord is the federal government incentivising states and territories to meet the $1.2 million new and well-located, I know you talked about that earlier, well-located homes target with a $3 billion allocation to the new homes bonus.
I would love to see that money just spent by the federal government building these houses. I think that as soon as we start handing money out to the states and they start handing money out to developers, and the profit motive takes over, then these houses aren't going to be built as structurally sound.
They are linked to targets, though, Mr. Tui.
Pardon?
I said it's linked to targets, but
I'm not so worried about the targets. I'm worried about whether they're going to be the most quality housing, and they're going to be. I just don't understand why we give federal money to the private market to build houses in a market to solve a problem that they created.
Right. So this is about incentivising states and territories, because obviously we would like to see states and territories building more housing as you do.
But using their public money, like using taxpayers' money to do that, or to outsource to the private market to build these houses and maintain the ownership of those public houses, because I think that there's a trend towards building social housing in this umbrella term, which is usually for-profit housing at an affordable rate, at market values, at market rates. When the market is unaffordable, then there can't be affordable housing at market rates, because there is no affordable housing at the market. So I think it's it's another example of shifting and muddying the waters when what we could see billions and billions of dollars invested in public housing that the government can maintain, employ people to work in, tenant through a fair and equitable system of with applications, and clear out the wait list in each state and territory, and probably even turn a profit, probably make a return on this housing, because the life of this building, if it's going to have people in there for 50 or 70 years, chances are the small amount, if you're making people pay 20% of their income in these houses, that it's going to see a return one day. So there's no reason why the government can't make more housing, can't maintain that housing, and there's no reason why the federal government can't do that to circumvent the states. And the federal government does do that. In this budget, there's plenty of money for building houses for American troops in the Northern Territory, and very little money for building houses for nurses in any state or territory in the country.
So what's your view then on the HAF?
I think it's the same problem, right? It's incentivizing investment and it's incentivizing an industry to fix a problem that they created. So I think that while it's good to see the extra $1 billion or so that the Greens won in that conversation, I think that it ultimately, I still don't see that $1 billion like being spent on what I'm talking about, on the nursing housing authority and the tradie housing authority and the teachers housing authority, building houses near schools for teachers so that they can afford to live near the school and teach the next generation. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing money and dollar figures being thrown out and this kind of plan that ultimately is still in service of an inflating housing market. It's just putting more money into a 10 or 11 trillion dollar housing market, and the more money that we put into that, the more expensive the housing market becomes as a total. So we need to be thinking about investing money in a way that doesn't see the housing market inflate. The only way to do that is by building publicly owned housing that is tethered to a lower than market rate rent asking or sold at a lower than market rent to pull house prices down and to pull rents down totally. But this government doesn't want to see house prices come down, and I understand that there's a lot of problems with that. I don't necessarily want to see I don't want to see the housing market crash. I believe that in my lifetime that is a likelihood if we continue doing what we're doing. But I think that ultimately we want to slow housing markets to a growth to a standstill, and unfortunately I will just have to wait for decades for my wages to make up the difference in that time of 0% housing growth for 20 years or so. So as long as we're still talking about house prices continuing to rise, even if it's just more slowly, we're just talking about, it's just kind of the equivalent of like driving a car off a cliff more slowly and saying that we're doing a better job, a safer job. We're still going off the cliff.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Deputy Chair. Can I ask a couple of follow-ups, Mr. Toohey? Every morning I wake up and I read the financial press at present, which talks about the softening of auction clearances, fewer properties being put on the market, and a real concern in the financial press about falling house prices. You've mentioned you don't want to see a crash in the housing market, but what is your sense about the current situation and the fact that we see these reports, and they vary from very modest changes that are slowing the rate of increase to some level of correction? What's your thinking about that?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting.
What do young people think about it is what I'm asking you. What's the response amongst the cohort of people that you're in touch with?
I think there's definitely conversations around that. Like the few friends that I have in the housing market that have gotten invested in the last couple of years and they're now on the bottom run of this housing Ponzi, they do worry about that kind of stuff because they don't want to be in negative equity. And that's a really bad thing for people to find themselves in, and I don't want anyone to be in negative equity because then you're just giving money to the banks for nothing, which you kind of already are anyway. But I think that the sense is that it's hard. This conversation is hard because, as I say, the people that are my generation, I'm into my 30s now, people have found scrappy ways to buy housing. They're getting their parents to guarantee the loan, or they have been lucky to get some money from their parents, or maybe they have used the 5% deposit scheme and they've gotten into the housing market, and there is a trepidation about hearing that the housing market may slow. The other thing is that I don't think that what we're seeing now can be really that much attributed directly to the policy changes, rather than the mindset shift that the policy changes are signaling. And so because of the grandfathering and things, it's not really possible for that to have that immediate effect. So I don't think. So I think that this is more of just people are waiting to see. People are going, well, if house prices come down more, then I maybe wait another 6 months, and therefore I'm not going to this auction. And so then clearance rates are going to slow down. So it is just because, as I made the point before, the entire housing market is a collective delusion that we've all decided that house prices must go up. And as soon as we start getting spooked on that, then we see a change, because it's purely based on behaviour. It's not based on the value of these homes. The homes that are maybe not clearing are no better in their function as shelter than they were yesterday, or 3 months ago, or 6 months ago, or 20 or 100 years ago when they were built. Their function is the same. If anything, they have depreciated in their value. A 100-year-old home, probably better built than a home built 5 years ago, but in theory should be depreciating in value, because like a car, it has wear and tear. But because we have this notion that they go up, we apply this fake value on top of house prices that is not in any way connected to the bricks and mortar. And so I don't know if this is answering your question, but I think that I think because of this, as I keep saying, the housing market is effectively a Ponzi scheme. It requires people to be at the most risk to then now advocate for a housing market that they only a year ago were frustrated by, because we still continue to encourage, through things like the 5% deposit scheme, people to get into the market to continue to inflate the market. So giving money, making it easier for people to afford a home in a housing market that is unaffordable, and we want the prices to go up, is only ever going to inflate it. And the 5% deposit scheme seems to have inflated house prices more than it's made it affordable for poorer people.
And we've got a new data this morning on the 5% deposit scheme. Just wonder what your thoughts in response to it is, which is that a third of those who have accessed the 5% deposit scheme between October, when it changed, to have no cap on its availability, no income cap, through to end of April this year. A third of the people who've accessed have been earning more than was previously capped. So if you're a single person, they're earning more than $125,000 a year. If you're a couple, more than $200,000 a year. So a lot of people there who probably could have got into the market, who are now using the 5% scheme to get in. And we've seen increases in prices. The press are arguing in relation, because the cap was removed. What are your thoughts about that?
I posted about the 5% deposit scheme at the time, and spoke to that idea that we're just encouraging more speculation. We're encouraging people to be able to take out bigger loans and buy a property that they wouldn't have otherwise. And if it's 1/3 of people that are above the cap, then that's evidence of that these are people that now have a propensity to purchase a house for more than they did before. They can bid out their peers, or they can buy something that's more expensive. And so that's not evidence of people getting their foot into the housing market just for its primary utility as a house. This is also people thinking strategically around house price inflation and what they can make money from. And so I think any shortcut that people can take, they'll take it. And I don't begrudge any single person that's taken the 5% deposit scheme. I'd probably look at it myself if I was in a position to buy a house, because it does get me there a little bit faster. I personally will never be investing in the housing market, because I don't think it's a smart investment in the long term, because I don't see a lot of, like I said before, a lot of fear of the crisis that we're in, a lot of actual taking the crisis seriously. I see tempered solutions. So I think that inevitably house prices will have to see a real correction, in the truly economic turn, and that is going to be very painful for our economy, because we have $11 trillion and growing stuck in our housing, stuck in the coffers of the banks that are making record profits, not actually investing in things that make our country better.
Last question. This is around, I've got a clear picture about your recommendations on rent, which are to graft onto home rentals some of the characteristics of commercial rent, which make a lot of sense to me anyway. But coming to the housing supply, you have spoken strongly in favour of public investment in housing. There is a lot of general talk about the need to grow supply. What's your sense about just the argument that we just need to grow any supply?
Well, that's a developer's argument. It's a property investor's argument. As I outlined before, as a percentage of our population, we have been building more supply than when we've been creating demand. So there has to be a surplus of housing out there. Some people throw around the census data from 2021, which is not the best data because the empty homes, include people on holidays and these kind of things. So it's not the most clear picture, but there is some data that looks in Victoria around water usage. And when you extrapolate that data, I don't have the exact figures, but you can find that there are plenty of houses. There are a lot of houses out there available in the hundreds of thousands, properties that would be great places for people to start a family or live out their life in whatever way they want. And so the supply and demand thing, I do think we need to build more housing. I think it should be public housing. I think the government could even be buying private property and turning that into public housing as we went. I think that there is more than enough houses here. I think that because people use it as a primary means of investment, they have them as Airbnbs, the developers are land banking. There's all sorts of reasons why that it's beneficial to keep them off the rental market or the housing market, but they don't actually, which means that those houses are not used as their primary function as shelter most of the time. So there's lots of rules. I know in Victoria they've changed the holiday housing rules. There's a vacancy. There's something to do with vacancies there. I think we could see a vacancy levy. I think that would be a good thing nationwide to do, and disincentivise land banking, disincentivise having your holiday home as a Airbnb or having a holiday home at all when there are people that are homeless. So I think that there's lots of conversation around supply and demand. I think that's because it's year 8 economics. Like, it's easy for most people to understand, but it just completely ignores the actual reality of our housing market, which is that we have been building more supply than demand for decades upon decades, because it's really profitable to build those houses. Like, it's always been incentive enough for these developers to build those houses. If they didn't, they wouldn't be so rich and so powerful. And of course, they want to build more houses because that's how they make their money. But it's not necessarily going to solve the housing crisis, because we've been building these houses, and we're still in a housing crisis. So.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Tui, for all your evidence this morning. We appreciate that, and your ongoing work communicating with the generation of people that we're interested in hearing about. We really appreciate you appearing today. I don't think you've taken any questions on those, but if you have or want to give us any further information, if we could get it within 2 weeks of you receiving the transcript of Hansard, that would be appreciated. And thanks so much for appearing.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you. We'll suspend for a couple of moments while we bring in our next witness.
Our next witness is online.
Oh, our next witness is...
doing a test before we get started.
Okay, great. Welcome Associate Professor Mark Humphrey-Jenner via video conference. Thank you for joining us. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear?
Yes, so my name's Mark Humphrey-Jenner. I am appearing, I guess, more in a personal capacity in that I'm not representing specifically UNSW, but I work at UNSW in the School of Banking and Finance, and I work for Otso Capital as well.
Great, thanks very much. So I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions, and Senator Bragg will lead us off.
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank all of the inquiry for inviting me to come along. And the housing inquiry, I think, comes at a very timely juncture in our economy, in that it's important to look at what exactly is driving issues with housing prices and what exactly constitutes housing affordability. So let's focus on that second part. What is housing affordability? Because a lot of what I see in the media talks about the purchase price for a property. But one thing that really needs to be focused on is the life cycle of property ownership, from purchase price through to the actual ownership through to the sale price. That is, we need to consider, is this person at least break even on their property throughout that life cycle of their ownership? Because if someone purchases a property and then ends up underwater in negative equity, that property has not been affordable. Much like if you go out and you buy a brand new vehicle, you end up losing a lot of money in depreciation, you end up owing the leasing company or the bank more than you paid for the car, that car was not affordable, unless you happen to have a lot of spare money to be able to throw at that vehicle. So I think that's the first point, focusing on what is affordability. But the second point is focusing on solutions to issues going on in the market. That is, what's going on with the number of houses, how to create more houses, and also what's going on with demand to some extent. And all of those things have different solutions and different policy tools. So for example, focusing on the supply side of it, how do we get more houses? Well, a lot of that comes down to what are the roadblocks to housing construction? Some of that involves some regulations. Some of the regulations can go by the wayside. Some are useful. Some of it also involves the sheer cost of building new houses. So one of the reasons off-the-plan developments are so expensive is because it is so expensive to build. And we see evidence of this through the thin margins the developers have and the sheer number of developers that have gone bankrupt, implying the developers can't skin more off their margin for them to remain viable and for construction to continue on. We've also got the issue in relation to demand for property. That is, are tax settings driving demand? And to my mind, we've seen some sentiment shift around the budget. However, if we think about, has the growth over the past couple of decades rather, been due to tax settings? A lot of it would really come down to the answer that no, it hasn't been. Because we can line up any house price growth graph with that of any other developed country. The United States, the United Kingdom, myriad other locations. And we see similar trends. And those locations didn't have the same capital gains tax changes Australia had quite some time ago. So just attributing house price growth to one thing like capital gains tax changes would of course be myopic. And that of course sets aside issues that we might touch upon, such as the downstream effects of capital gains tax changes, such as on stamp duty, transaction volume, which then feeds into state government budgets. Furthermore, we've got the issue of the role of the federal and state governments here. In particular, where the federal government can incentivize the states to develop property or develop housing or enable developments in ways that are more space efficient, such as, for example, enabling more terrace houses to create more density without forcing people necessarily into apartment blocks. So levers like that can help things move along. So in short, I think this is a very timely inquiry. I think it's important to dig really deeply into some of the changes that might be beneficial.
Thank you for that opening statement. Over to you, Senator Bragg.
Thanks very much. So I guess the first thing I'll go to is the question of the tax changes. Do you think these tax changes will help the housing crisis or will they make it worse?
Well, I think, firstly, let's take for granted there is a crisis, because what exactly constitutes a crisis, I think we need to dig deeper into. But in terms of the tax changes, I don't see any way they're going to help. So let's unpackage that. Firstly, for example, my younger brother, but this is just anecdotal, but he's just one member of a cohort. He bought a property over the past 6 months. I can't see these tax changes benefiting him, because if he's ended up in negative equity, then now he ends up digging himself out of that negative equity. So there's a large cohort of people that bought over the past few years that are now incredibly worried about the impact of this on them. And you might be asking, well, okay, so this tax change is called a blip down in property. So is that now going to benefit the next cohort of first home buyers?
Yeah.
And for a very small number of people, it will benefit them. The people who buy during the blip down, they will benefit because they'll be buying while they're trying to catch a falling knife, assuming they catch that falling knife. However, that still doesn't address the underlying problem of demand continues to grow through population increases and supply is not growing. And when we get this decrease in property and in particular uncertainty surrounding things, you're going to get less development. And we can unpackage that. Firstly, you've got the uncertainty. That creates an increased opportunity cost of capital, which deters developers from actually developing. Because when they're thinking about, well, what are the policy changes going to be and are they going to go to an election? Well, that creates a lot of pause for developers. Secondly, developers aren't actually that profitable because just look at the number that have gone bankrupt. That tells you they're not actually making money hand over fist, because otherwise you'd have more and more developers going forward developing more and more properties. That isn't really happening. So with these changes, the increased uncertainty, a blip down in prices, you're going to get less development. Now that does of course mean that prices are going to stabilize. So it's not as if prices are going to keep falling, because when prices fall a bit, some developers will come in and they'll be like, okay, there's no other developers in the market. Let's try to make a bit of a profit developing when no one else is. So they will reach an equilibrium point. The big issue, of course, is this doesn't help supply over the long term. It doesn't encourage the developers to come in. And it also specifically, I think, and something that hasn't been talked about in the media nearly enough, is it deters mum and dad developers. So here I'm talking about people building granny flats. I'm talking about people renovating properties and then selling them. So for example, say you were to go and buy a dilapidated house, completely unlivable or very, very old. You go and renovate that and you sell it. That's a mum and dad developer play or a tradie developer play. That's the type of thing that ordinary Australians do quite frequently. But these new tax settings are going to dramatically increase the tax rate that that person would be paying. And ironically, they'd now be paying a higher tax rate, nearly 47% in effect, relative to the person that was just cruising on an apartment in inner city. So in Melbourne, the CBD apartments they've had anemic growth, sometimes negative growth. Similarly in Sydney CBD. So your tax rate now, ironically, is lower buying and holding an apartment than it is actually developing the apartment or actually developing the property. And that actually deters supply growth. So you've got a whole lot of unintended consequences. And then you've got the issue of, well, say we're wanting the government, normatively speaking, to get into the housing market in terms of affordable housing. Well, the money has to come from somewhere to do that. So if we're seeing stamp duty falling, well, how is a state government developing affordable housing when they're getting less stamp duty? Because they're now getting less tax revenue, but we're trying to get them to develop more. The two don't compute. And we're seeing early signs of this.
So effectively, your argument is that higher taxes will result in fewer houses.
Correct. I mean, there's no world in which a developer is going to build more when they're taxed more. There's no world in which the government can build more when the stamp duty is decreased. There's no world in which the government can build more when overall tax revenue is fallen. And I recently did a paper that shows that the tax revenue the government generates is actually going to decrease when you factor in all of the second order effects, lock-in effects, growth effects, fiscal spillovers like the stamp duty effect. When you factor in all of those, total government revenue could easily decrease on the back of increasing the capital gains tax rates.
Well, it seems to me that one behavioural response, and you'll know more about this than me, Associate Professor, is going to be in relation to people then over-capitalising on their own principal place of residence, because of course that is tax exempt. So is there a scenario where you see people investing more than they need to in their own place of residence now because of this very high and punitive tax on anything else in housing?
Yeah, so at the moment, your best investment in Australia is your principal place of residence. I mean, it is, that's 0% tax, right? And I was having this conversation tangentially with startup investors recently. And you just look at it this way. The mortgage interest rate is about 6%, possibly higher depending on your characteristics. So let's go with 6% for a round number. For someone at the highest marginal tax rate, that's equivalent to a 12% return on another investment, which I'll note is above the ASX 200 in most years. But that is risk-free. So that's a 12% risk-free return. So you then add an equity risk premium, that takes it up to 17% at least. So you add on another liquidity and additional risk premium for startups. You wouldn't invest in them, because why would you invest in that asset class when the opportunity cost of capital is simply much higher than the return you are likely to make? So putting in your principal place of residence makes sense. Now, of course, the question is that going to enable more people to get into their first home? And that's an interesting wrinkle, because theoretically, if you get all of the investors out of the market, then you will have more owner-occupiers. A property needs to sell from person A to person B.
Sure.
But if supply is not forthcoming, you're not going to get more owner-occupiers because the supply isn't there and rents are going to go up, which makes it more difficult to save to buy your property. Because if your rent is high, then how are you saving to buy your deposit or your stamp duty? That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that the people who were investing a lot into the owner-occupied property, let's face it, I'm in finance, so for me, just piling all in on property wouldn't necessarily be the most obvious route for someone with my background. However, for mum and dad investors or mum and dad owner-occupiers, they don't necessarily have much familiarity with equity derivatives. They don't necessarily have much familiarity with the ETFs in the United States that they might want to invest in. There's a large number of people that don't have that background. So they end up with money they want to deploy. Where do they deploy it? Well, to some extent deploying it in housing, but with lower returns. And that's what we often see.
Yeah, but ultimately, like, to go back to the fundamentals, the supply and the demand. So if you sort of zoom out, the supply is too low and it has collapsed over the last few years, and the migration has been high. So the combination of increased demand from migration and then lower supply of housing, I would have thought that those two factors would still be the principal drivers of the housing problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got large immigration. It varies a little bit about the characteristics of it, but at least quite large immigration, high numbers. And that's been consistent over time. So immigration is cumulative, right? In that it's not like you can just decrease it in 1 year and then your immigration goes down because you don't get a population decrease. You just get a slightly lower increase. So you've got increasing demand from population growth and supply is simply not keeping up. And there are several reasons for that. One, it is incredibly expensive to build. It's been estimated by various sources that up to half the cost of a build is government tax related. Then it's also incredibly slow to build. So you go to any apartment construction and you might go there this year if it starts, and then 3-4 years down the track, it will still be under construction.
Yeah.
So the time and cost makes it very difficult to get more supply.
So if you come back to this supply issue, is there any argument at all that can be justified to kick investors out? If ultimately you need more investment to build more housing, then can there be an argument? I mean, obviously, the government have advanced an argument that they want to have fewer investors. I would have thought that right now what we want is as many investors as we can to get the supply up. So is there any good argument from a finance academic point of view that can be credibly advanced that there is the notion of bad investment?
In short, no, not in this context. And I'll use an analogy that I think is going to help to illustrate it. So say, for example, and the share-related analogy I think is the best way of putting it. Say you've got a startup that needs to raise capital, or a company that needs to raise capital. It needs to go out and sell shares to the market. It needs to get a reasonable price for those shares for it to be able to raise capital to keep investing. So that primary market then feeds into the secondary market, which is the price you can receive for those shares.
Yeah.
The same thing occurs with property. You need a well-functioning secondary market of existing development or existing supply for the primary market to get off the ground. So no developer is going to develop when their own buyers are deterred from investing. So, for example, say a buyer of that new property is thinking, okay, I can maybe access negative gearing or the capital gains tax discount, but then their own seller, when they go to sell it, won't be able to. So they will obviously think about that second effect. You need to think about to whom you are selling the property. And developers will think about to whom they are selling, and that an original buyer will think about to whom they are selling down the track. And for many people, myself included, you start off renting and then owner-occupied, which is where things like rent vesting come in. So you often do need investors to generate that initial supply, which can then feed into the owner-occupied market. And when you get more supply and enable more supply, it enables rents to normalize, which enables people to save to buy property more, but it also creates more supply in the market, enabling more people to get into the property market.
So the contradiction here seems to me to be that the policy is that we don't want individual mum and dads or individual Australians to invest too much in housing, but we do want large wholesale funds to do that. That's the policy of the Labor government, where there's now a system of arbitrage, isn't there, where if you're a super fund, you'll only pay, I think it's 10% capital gains. A foreign fund manager investing through a managed investment trust would pay 15%, but then a person investing in the same underlying property would have to pay 30%. So, I mean, what's the justification from an academic point of view to say that there's some forms of investment that we do want if you're a big fish, but if you're a small fish, a small person, we don't want you? Can you explain this to me? I don't understand it.
Yeah, so basically, if I'm understanding correctly, you're effectively asking, is there any rationale for having a lower tax rate applicable to a super fund relative to an SMSF or relative to a mum and dad investor?
That's
and
right.
why is it that overseas investors could theoretically potentially get a lower capital and lower tax rate, although there are some wrinkles associated with foreign investors? And in reality, there isn't a lot of reason for treating the same investment done by an industry super fund as being different from that being done from SMSFs. So an SMSF, which is now unable to really borrow to purchase property, is going to now effectively be, in a capital investing perspective, in a worse position than a large industry super fund. And the reason for that is a large industry super fund has access to capital from myriad sources. It's a big pot of assets. So it can go out and raise this capital. Whereas a small mum and dad SMSF, well, its only ability to borrow is really, unless there's some unusual circumstances, but basically only through the bank, only through those general structures that have now been banned. So the question is, should they be taxed higher than an industry super fund? I don't see any rationale for it. Particularly since those SMSF investors.
So the only reason to make that distinction is political.
It would look like I cannot point to another reason for that.
So there's no academic or economic reason to penalise individuals, is there?
There's not relative to a big industry super fund or anything similar like that. There's no reason to penalise an individual or to level them with a higher rate than any other entity.
Okay. Well, look, just finally then, thanks for clarifying that. The government have said that these tax changes are about housing measures, but then they've hit everything with a 30% capital gains tax. So I'm just trying to make sense of that as well. I guess those are the two issues I've struggled to understand from an economic viewpoint. Why would you penalise individuals relative to institutions in terms of investing into housing and providing housing stock? You've explained that. And then the second one is, why does a so-called housing measure need to hit the whole economy with a 30% minimum CGT?
To be direct, if you were to really have these measures being about housing, you would have reduced CGT on shares and startups relative to that of housing. So if your real goal was to shift investment behavior entirely from housing into shares, what you would have done is slash CGT on shares and not kept it at this new higher level. And I'll use an illustration to make this clearer, or at least an analogy. Like I mentioned before, property price growth in Sydney CBD and Melbourne CBD. Look at the apartments. Any real estate agent will tell you that forever they've been difficult to sell and price growth has been terrible in the middle of the CBD. It's ironically where one of the most affordable places to live is, right in the middle of the city. So that individual will probably face 0% capital gains tax under the new regime because their price growth could easily be under inflation. By contrast, someone investing in shares will be facing an exponentially higher capital gains tax rate, particularly if they've done a good job. Someone renovating property is now going to face a much higher tax rate than someone who is just sitting passively on that property. It means that if the real goal were to stop passive sitting on property, this actually goes in the opposite direction because that's actually the most tax advantaged. It's an interesting policy wrinkle that's come from it, I think.
Thank you, Associate Professor. You make a lot of sense. Next, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Bragg. I wanted to ask you, in your opening comments, you didn't you covered a lot of ground, but you didn't mention the question of your perspective on intergenerational equity, and I'm just curious about how you see that. We've had a lot of evidence pointing to very significant changes in the rental regime that 30-year-olds, 20-year-olds face now, longer periods of rent, higher rent relative to income, very low vacancy rates. And when we look at, for example, at the Grattan Institute data on generational change in income growth, the generation born in 1990s, the first generation that at least we've got data for, where we see no improvement in income relative to the previous generation 30 years earlier. I just wonder what your perspective then is about housing, whether you're a homeowner or a renter, and intergenerational change.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things to maybe unpackage there. I guess almost tautologically, older people will own more than younger people. Of course. I mean, it's just the fact of being older, right? And you've had more years to accumulate things. So I don't per se see there as being an inequity to solve by virtue of, say, my father earning more than me.
No,
or
but
myself.
Sorry to interrupt you, but yes, you make that point in your words, but in your submission, as I recollect. But we're trying to compare like with like. The moment in a generation compared to the same moment for the generation earlier, and there seems to me, a lot of data pointing to a disadvantage if we're comparing like with like at the moment of their moment of intergenerational life.
I think it's very difficult to just compare like for like, because say, for example, we look at the baby boomers, they were often born in the wake of the disruption and chaos from World War II, right? So the older generation were built in a country that was often rebuilding its economy from an extremely harsh circumstance. So they might have gotten in at a good time, but also they suffered other disruptions. Furthermore, their life was different in different ways. So, for example, whereas many younger people can work from home, the older generation was not. So you end up with swings and roundabouts in terms of what one generation has benefited from, what one generation has not benefited from. So it's really difficult to compare the two. Focusing on some of the things you've mentioned, though, say we're looking at income growth. The issue in relation to income growth is real and it is genuine. And I think that many millennials feel as if they reach a career ceiling and are therefore unable to get ahead. And potentially costs are running ahead of what they're able to afford. That, however, is a slightly separate issue from per se what we do about housing or what we do about any other asset or what we do about any other price. So to point onto this, say your income is growing really slowly, but groceries are skyrocketing or petrol prices are skyrocketing or energy prices are skyrocketing. So the question is, does the government intervene in relation to all of those prices, or what is the actual policy solution? And in terms of solving income issues, the question is, how do we get around enabling people to get ahead so that they aren't continually feeling further and further behind? Some of that might come down to enabling better entrepreneurship. Some of it might come down to enabling side hustles. Some of it might come down to enabling people to just invest in crypto. Now, I don't invest in crypto, nor do I necessarily advocate it, but many people have and have made some money doing so to get ahead because they realize that their own personal income is growing anemically. And I think they're perhaps separate issues we need to address.
Well, last question then. What's your view? We've just heard this morning and we've heard from other witnesses about the rental market being very different, whether you're participating in commercial rental versus home rental, with commercial rental having longer lease periods, very conventionally, an inflation-related adjustment to your rent, and having more control over the use of your commercial rental property. What's your thought about what explains the differences and whether home rental arrangements should be adjusted?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting comment that I'd seen about that, and I think when we're analysing this, it's not per se that it's bad to necessarily have those commercial arrangements. It's just that we need to consider the totality of the commercial arrangement. So say we're looking at a commercial lease, the way they're typically structured is like a 3x3, or maybe a 2x2x2. So that is 2 years followed by 2 years followed by 2 years. So you break them down like that. And during that 2-year period or that 3-year period, which is set by contract between the individuals, it varies a lot. You'll get CPI-ish increases, maybe about 4%, give or take a bit. And then there'll be a rental review mid-lease or at that period. So after 2 years or whenever it is according to the lease terms. So that means that the rents aren't per se capped at CPI in commercial. Because what happens is they'll be at that capped rate, which is decided by contract, and that capped rate could be 10%, it could be 1%. It's just whatever they determine. Then there's a market rent review at the juncture normally, which means you'll get that rent review. In terms of, and that creates a longer term lease as well. So you've got, it's not per se CPI, but also the leases are longer, which is one of the other points. Now, in some ways that's true, but that isn't necessarily because the tenant is the only one who wants a longer lease in that case. Often the landlord does. And the reason for that is in commercial leases, you get incredibly long vacancy rates. So say, for example, you had a convenience store that shuts down. It might be another 3, 4, 5, 6 months until you get another tenant. So you try to lock in the longer term because of those vacancy rates. Those vacancy rates also result in higher rent rates relative to residential. So the rental yield on commercial is typically higher than the rental yield on residential as well. Now, admittedly, part of that comes down to interest rates, but another part of it does come down to the dynamics of those leases as well. So if one is looking at transforming residential into commercial, we just need to consider what aspects are we changing. And if we're just changing the lease term, then you will end up with other unintended consequences over the long term. So say, for example, we require the lease terms to be at the option of the tenant, 5 years. To use an example that I believe I kind of heard broadly speaking from the prior guest. So say it were 5 years, then you've got a landlord who is thinking, okay, do I want to lease it out for 5 years? And some of them will. Like some will be like, okay, I just want to forget about this, lease it out, be perfectly okay with that. And I think many landlords want to keep a good tenant for as long as humanly possible. I.e., if you've got a good tenant, you don't kick them out because, I mean, you could replace them with someone who will trash your place. So I can see why it could work. Potentially at the option of both parties, I think that you would need both parties to have a buy-in. Because that person who might be renting it out now might be saving to be able to renovate it. Or there might be a rent investor who can't quite move into it right now, but they're intending to down the track. Or there's someone who is moving overseas for university, so a master's degree, or maybe they're moving overseas for a job, they intend to come back. So the 5-year term does create a lot of issues in terms of people who might be looking at moving into their own house. So it's something that would need to be thought about, I think, in a totality type approach, like a looking at it throughout the life cycle of the ownership and all of the aspects of typical commercial leases.
Well, thank you so much for your evidence this morning, Associate Professor. The committee's agreed that... Oh, sorry, Senator Brown. Forgive me, I didn't notice you had questions. Please ask your questions.
Yes, sorry, I'll be quick, Chair. I know we're running behind time. I missed it. How important is supply to being part of the housing fix?
Supply is definitely important in that. I mean, let's look at it this way. We've got relatively high immigration rates. I dare say that just personally, I'm much more pro-immigration than many people. You go ahead. You go ahead, Senator Brown.
I was just saying the immigration rates have come down when we look at the peak of in the 2020.
Oh, yes, for sure. So immigration rates have come down, but immigration is cumulative. So say, for example, immigration ran above supply
That's okay.
for 2
We
years.
go back to my original question. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, so the question is, how important is supply? Well, very important, because we've got people coming in and population is increasing, so you definitely need more supply. Otherwise, you're just not going to have enough houses.
Yep. So in your work, have you had a look to see where investors are actually investing, whether they're established houses or are they building more supply?
So when we're looking at this, the established houses, I think, need to come in two categories, i.e. established houses that you just sit on and established houses that you renovate or improve. Because that second category definitely improves the quality and quantity of supply. So someone who renovates an unlivable house, while that house technically existed, it now is effectively new supply. Someone who builds a granny flat or builds an attic conversion, that's additional supply. So I think we need to be really careful about just homogenizing all existing developments because they're not the same. Many people will, both owner-occupiers and investors, buy existing developments if possible. And part of the reason for that is new developments are just so expensive. It's just so expensive to build that a new off-the-plan development typically is going to trade for much more than an existing house. So purely from an affordability perspective, most people will look at that existing property. However, you do get some people who prefer those off-the-plan ones. Either people who prefer something to take advantage of depreciation, which is greater in those new off-the-plan developments, or someone who doesn't want to deal with the issues that go wrong in an older property. So you definitely get those. You need those investors in the off-the-plan. Many of those investors are often coming from overseas or are PR here, and they prefer to buy off-the-plan as well. So you definitely get investors in those mixes as well. Most developers will tell you need the investors for those developments to actually be viable.
So, but you don't have any figures in terms of percentages?
In terms of percentages of what percentage of investor purchases are in new versus established, I don't have that percentage. I'd need to look that up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's fine. I'm not sure, but are you supportive of the initiatives the federal government put in place around that support increasing housing supply and infrastructure?
So I think it depends a little bit. Are you referring specifically to things like in the budget or broadly speaking?
Not just this last budget in terms of, regardless of your position on the tax changes, but I'm talking about since the government's come in 2022, but the National Housing Accord, the Housing Australia Future Fund, the funds that have been put into environmental approval reform, simplifying building regulations, those sorts of changes.
Yes, so absolutely there have been some good things done. And indeed, I'm not per se opposed to some of the government's measures in relation to the 5% deposit scheme, in that I can understand why they have done that. So absolutely, this isn't to say that the federal government has been completely asleep at the wheel or that everything they've done is bad. I can see some benefits. So infrastructure development is vital in that you need electricity and plumbing and the like for you to be able to get new housing developments. Some of the other things that federal and state have done in terms of trying to make, I'm not sure whether the correct term is outer suburban areas, but outer suburban areas more livable, whether that's due to developments of city centres or airports and things, or also and admittedly this is more state, but I know the federal gets a lot on board with this as well, developing public transport. So New South Wales Metro in Sydney is a game changer for housing supply coming online because it now makes places like Rouse Hill significantly more attractive to be able to live in and develop than
Yeah.
before. So absolutely there are benefits there.
So, at the macro level, what changes need to take place over time to improve things?
Yes, so at the macro level, well, we've got several changes. If we were to look at things that would really help to move the needle, firstly, I think we need to have quicker approval processes, although I know some of that has been done, and a lot of it is at the local council level, which means that when we've got this separation of levels of government, it's a lot of us just point at the federal government and say it's your fault, but in reality, it might be a council thing. But if one can help to move the needle on councils, now, City of Sydney is the one I've had the most experience with. They've done quite well, but there are other councils that make things very difficult. Secondly, improving issues around density, by which I mean enabling more things like row houses or terrace houses that improve density without forcing people into apartments. And those can be enabled across the board, which, much like in Vietnam, helps to improve density, for example. A third thing would be, in reality, I don't think that the tax changes that have been brought in are going to be beneficial. I think there'll be a short blip down and then growth is going to resume as soon as the market adjusts. I think that's something that really needs to be thought about what is the revenue maximizing tax the government can impose. And I know that the budget had other issues, but the tax rate that's being imposed, I think, is not going to maximize federal government revenue. And if the goal is to maximize revenue, well, that is not going to achieve it through that higher capital gains tax regime. So those are the main things, reducing the cost and increasing the speed with which you can do housing construction, basically. And some of those are at the federal level.
Absolutely. I mean, the government's invested $2 billion in enabling infrastructure to unlock 65,000 new homes, but and also we simplifying building regulations is an important issue. Do you have information around housing starts at all?
So new housing construction, I don't have specific numbers, but I also know that they have cooled. And that is in large part because we can see the trepidation in the market, and also because we can see what's happening with interest
Would you
rates.
be able to actually, on notice, provide some information around, because as we know, housing starts were up about 26% just last year, so it'd be nice to see. It's probably a little bit early, Professor, but we'll see what you can go back a couple, from 2022 or further, actually. Whatever you think's useful for our committee, that would be good.
Yeah, I can have a look at that. I know that I've looked, as an aside, I've looked at construction, but not in that type of figure that you're looking at. So as something that I'm sure will be available, in that I've done some needlessly technical, but what's called vector error correction modeling of house prices and population growth. So the two definitely go hand in hand. And part of that modeling involves construction. So construction data is available. Some of it from the ABS, but the level of granularity I'd need to check on.
Okay. Whatever you could supply, that would be good. Last question, Chair. I just, in your experience, what interest is there in the private equity market in investing in social and affordable housing projects?
All right, so it's an interesting field. So in the super funds, I've seen some interest. The main issue that arises with investors in those fields, and admittedly, this might be belying my family's background in medicine, but you'll see the analogy in a second. If you lock yourself into what rent is the government going to set, you lock yourself into an extremely bad position. Much like if you're a doctor and you lock yourself into the Medicare rebate, you lock yourself into a losing position, which is why dentists have notoriously tried to resist being part of the Medicare regime. Similarly, with housing, with affordable housing, you end up with it being very unattractive because of the sheer risk you face in relation to government rents that are going to be paid. So I probably should have taken a back step. That's for rent-controlled affordable housing. For affordable housing where you've got part of the development being affordable, so for example, you're building 100 apartments, 5 of them are affordable, so to speak. Now, it isn't necessarily going to sink all property development deals. The problem that arises is that just increases the cost of the build implicitly, in that you're implicitly selling some apartments below market or below break even. And as a result, your costs effectively go up implicitly, which means a project that might have been viable, if those types of levies get too high, it becomes unviable. And then in the search of affordable housing, you get no housing. So I think it's important to consider those. In terms of private equity, I've seen relatively little interest, both in Australia and the United States, in what I've observed, because we don't have that much private equity building in Australia. In the United States, most of the PE is going to build to rent. And build to rent can be great, but it is expensive to rent it. So I'm not sure it's necessarily the panacea, because if you look at the build to rent developments in the US, they're typically renting above market, and they rent above market because it's turnkey and they do everything for you, which is nice, but they aren't necessarily affordable.
Well, thanks for that. But I was wondering, again, on notice, you said there's little interest. I was just wondering whether you could give me some more information or give the committee some more information around PE, the PE market, and what it looks like in Australia.
Yep.
Thanks, Professor.
Definitely.
I enjoyed your evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brown, and thank you, Associate Professor, for your evidence this morning. There are a couple of questions on notice. We thank you for that, and we invite you to give us any responses within 2 weeks of you receiving a copy of the Hansard transcript. But we appreciate your appearance today and your evidence this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me as well. Thank you.
Great. Now we'll just suspend for a couple of minutes as we settle in the next witnesses. Great. So I now welcome representatives from Better Renting. Thank you for being here in person. That's lovely, and thank you for your submission. I understand information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, is that the case? Yes. And for the Hansard record, could you please begin by stating your full names and the capacity in which you appear?
I'm Angela Cartwright. I'm appearing as CEO of Better Renting.
I'm Mirabelle Summers and I'm appearing as a Better Renting volunteer.
Great, thank you. Lovely to have a volunteer along as well. So now I invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of those remarks I'll lead off with some questions.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for providing the opportunity to give evidence before the committee around the experience of renters when it comes to housing equity and inequity in Australia. As we've said, I'm Angela Cartwright. I'm the CEO of Better Renting, and I'm joined by our wonderful volunteer, Mirabelle Summers, who is a strong advocate for renters' rights. Better Renting is a small national housing justice charity, and we work with and for renters to secure affordable, stable, safe, and comfortable housing for all people in Australia. And we think this is really central to shared values around security and belonging. Renting is a central component of our housing system, with 1/3 of households renting. And our research has shown that the majority of the general community believe that a home should provide a sense of belonging and security, whether it's owned or rented. We've also found that the majority of the community believe that landlords should be required to provide affordable, comfortable, safe housing. And we've found that the majority of the community expects governments to require landlords to meet these expectations and reform the rental system so that it works fairly for renters. Yet, unfortunately, around the country, we've seen governments failing to meet these societal expectations, and this has exposed renters to significant housing inequity. So we really welcome this inquiry and the focus on inequity. For many, many years, we've seen people wringing their hands and furrowing their brows about the housing crisis while maintaining the very policies that have maintained and even exacerbated inequity, and not taking the policies that will help increase housing equity. And that word, inequity, is crucial here. It doesn't just speak to the inequality in the housing system, but it speaks to the fact that this is systemic, that it is the responsibility of governments to fix. So inequity is something that is unfair and it can be changed. Our focus here as Better Renting is very squarely on people who are renting, the 1/3 of households in this country, and across every generation, renters are experiencing housing inequity. And so really importantly, that means that these reforms that are available right now to governments will help renters of all generations. And Mirabelle is here today to answer questions from the committee when it comes to her experience living as a renter growing up and now as a renter herself, as well as her community, her family, and what they want to see in terms of policy reforms. And I'm here to speak to Better Renting's submission, and to the extent I can, any kind of broader questions as they relate to the terms of reference for this inquiry. So again, thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak about how renters experience housing inequity.
Thank you for that and your comprehensive submission. Mirabelle, if I can come to you, could you tell us a little about your experience growing up as a renter and now as a renter as an adult?
Yeah, so I've lived in about 14 rental properties in my 19 years of life. And growing up renting is not necessarily been a bad thing, but over the last few years, or maybe let's say like even before COVID, it shifted from our homes being somewhere stable and somewhere that was enough space for my family to live comfortably, to moving every year, to living in tiny 2-bedroom units. And the whole reason that I've moved out of home is because it was actually affecting our quality of life in our relationships as a family because of how close we were living together. And yeah, that was a very difficult decision my parents had to make, whether it was going to be providing me with a high quality lifestyle or saving to buy a home. You know, I was able to go to dance and go to the cafe on the weekend and go on holidays and things like that. Even down to the food we had in our fridge was dependent on that decision that they made, and now they are also lifelong renters.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask then, you're describing a change over time. What do you think's caused that change in your family's experience? What's shifted? What's changed for you guys? Price of renting?
Yeah, price of renting, because if anything, my parents have started to earn more money than they were previously. And, you know, we moved to Sydney in 2015 from Newcastle. Okay. And we moved to the inner west because it was, at that time, somewhere that was affordable for families. And it very rapidly started to shift away from that.
There are a number of stories in your submission, as I recollect. Is your story one of them, or no?
No, it's not personally.
No, personally. And you are now renting in an area of Sydney?
Yes, in the inner west as well.
Inner west, okay. You associate yourself in your submission with other people making submissions around renting, and you point to the need for reform and that it's government responsibility that you see centrally here. Could you talk through what you think are the most important things for government to be doing right now around reforms on rent?
Absolutely, and I think obviously this is a Senate inquiry, so we have focused in our submission in terms of what the Australian government can be doing, but we very much recognise that the government has stepped forward and provided a leadership role in the past when it comes to, for example, the National Cabinet's Better Deal for Renters. So there is a role for leadership and, for example, incentives for improving renting that the federal government absolutely must take. I think the areas where kind of thematically we need to see big reforms that would make renting the viable alternative to home ownership that it should be fall under the categories that we've addressed in a recent report with Annika Legal and the Consumer Policy Research Centre, which is titled Essential Homes. In that report, we made the case that renting should be treated like all other essential services, and the really key themes or areas where these reforms are needed to do that are stability, affordability, comfort, and accountability. So when it comes to, I would say, all of these areas, tax reform is absolutely critical. So we see, for example, the historic use of the capital gains tax discount together with negative gearing as really kind of supercharging the current approach we have or the current experience of inequity that many renters face. Because what these policies have done is really kind of prioritise short-term speculative investment. And what that leads to is, even with the state and territory governments around the country that have tried to reform eviction laws in recent years to require that landlords provide a reason to evict a tenant, that those reasons are still allowing too many landlords to make a renter either homeless or have to move every 1 or 2 years, because one of the main reasons that we hear is given from renters is the landlord is selling. So these tax reforms typically mean, when it comes, I think especially to hobby landlords, so people who have one property, that they either have the interest rate hike that they can't afford, that means they have to sell, or there's a problem with the property that they can't afford. We've addressed in the Essential Homes report that lending requirements under ASIC do not require that an investor demonstrate that they can meet repair or maintenance costs. But of course, we also see that with the astronomical explosion in house prices, landlords will just sell up when the profit is big enough, and for too long that has been supported by these generous tax breaks for people wealthy enough to own bonus homes. I think rent increases, we understand that it's hard to tie down the escalation in rents to one particular factor. What we're very confident about at Better Renting is that maintaining this tax treatment and hoping that something is magically going to shift is probably not the answer. So I think that the real concern for us with how these tax breaks have operated is they have probably contributed in some way to affordability, but definitely to stability because of this impact on speculative investment. And we think that the reforms that the Parliament has just passed are very positive in terms of starting to reset investment towards responsible, long-term provision of the essential service of housing. And hopefully part of that will affect the other themes in our Essential Homes report, like comfort, which can also be described as health, so healthy homes. If you're holding a home for a couple of years, you're probably not going to bother too much with maintenance or repairs. And we hear all the time from renters, they're too scared even to ask for the repairs because they might get another rent increase. And Mirabelle might be able to speak to that a bit more. Or they might get evicted. That is simply what many renters have experienced, and they live in fear of that. So there's no incentive really if you're holding onto a property for a couple of years. There's data from past research from Inequity that says I think it's a quarter of landlords exit the market within a year of entering, and 6 in 10 within, I think it's 5 years, and I can take that on notice and provide that it's in our report.
Great if you would chase that.
Yes.
We'd like those data, that's very helpful.
And there was previous research that was kind of looking at this trend over 20 years or so. Ahuri refers to it as the continual entering and exiting from the market of private landlords. So we think that if we've got people who have this extra money and they really are committed to providing a rental home to someone, that they might be willing to consider whether they can pay for maintenance and repairs, whether that is a good investment for them. and perhaps even some upgrades that might make the home livable, comfortable throughout the various seasons and conditions we have across this country.
So Mirabelle, would you like to comment on what it's like to us?
I'd like to speak to the stability. I moved out in August last year, and the last 4 years of living with my parents, we lived in 3 different rental homes due to various reasons, none of those being our choice. I know one of those properties was being sold, one of them the lease wasn't extended, those kind of things, or being priced out. With the price increase in terms of improvements to the home, we recently asked for a lease extension for our property, and we were quoted that it would be a price increase from $610 a fortnight to $650 to $660 a fortnight, and I was told that that was in line with the Consumer Price Index increase over the last 12 months. When I did a little bit of digging into that, I found out that that was actually a 7.38% increase, and the CPI has only increased 4% from May 25 to May 26, which would actually, if that increase was in line with CPI, as our agent told us, that would be an increase to $634, so significantly less. I then said, if that's what the owner would like, we need to have some appropriate measures to reduce the heat inside our property, because over the summer we were involved in a better renter research program where we tracked the temperature of our home from December to, I think it would have been the end of February, and there was many nights, probably the majority of nights, that did not drop below 27 degrees inside our property. The highest temperature recorded was 35.5 degrees inside our property at 10 p.m. at night. The World Health Organization defines a healthy indoor temperature as ranging between 18 to 24 degrees Celsius. And so our house being 35.5, I don't feel that that is in line with that. I did a little bit of digging, and I was very surprised to find that this was not something that we could argue as being inhabitable, because I do believe it was inhabitable. It was affecting our quality of life, our ability to stay in our home, comfort, our ability to cook. That's just adding heat, all of those things. And so when I asked, I gave a variety of different options of different prices. I don't know what the owner's position is financially. And they came back to me saying that they could install blackout blinds, which we have already installed in a renter-friendly way with tension rods in our property to try and reduce the heat. They said they would do that, and if we wanted it in the bedrooms, it would be $650, an increase to $650, or if we would like it in the lounge room as well, which is actually the hottest part of the home that heats up the home, it would be an increase to $660, which would completely price us out as 2 students who work part-time. And so we have decided to settle for a lesser increase and suffer through the summer again. Our house also is very, very cold at the moment, but that's not an issue to us because we are able to heat ourselves up, wear extra clothes, hot water bottles, heat up a room, but it's near impossible to cool down our house. We've had to have our front door open into the lobby to try and get a cross breeze when there was a breeze in summer, and all of those sorts of things. It's just not, I'm surprised that everyone else, there's 8 units in our complex. Every other person that I've spoken to, especially the people who live in there that do own their homes, they all have air conditioning because of the building, yeah.
So no air conditioning in your apartment, and unable to find a solution which made the rent affordable for you as well as safe by the standards that you talked about, and you don't have any platform to stand on in terms of what's safe or comfortable for a renter.
And many of the other solutions that would be possible are not deemed rental friendly. We would then risk being in trouble at the end of our lease for damaging the property or making changes to the property.
Did you feel insecure negotiating as you have with your landlord? How was that experience?
So that took me about a month and a half, and I'm very lucky that I was confident enough to take that on, and that I had the support of Better Renting and other members, volunteers at Better Renting, to sort of bounce things off. But yeah, it was really just a lot of negotiating and saying that that's going to price us out and we will move out. We are already paying $10 above the asking price because we wanted to, this was our first rental, so we wanted to get our foot in the door, and it was advertised for $600, so we offered an extra $10. And I used that when I was discussing with them, and I used the temperature and things like that. And, you know, eventually I just said, you know, we are going to have an increase to $640 or we're going to move out. But realistically, moving out wasn't necessarily an option for us. There's not really anywhere else we could move. There's nothing available. I think there was about 4 properties available that would have been about the same price. And so that would have just sent us both back home, which is not really a viable option for either of us.
Yes, both of you. Well, you talked about your own family experience of the space being really the reason you needed, because of the pressure on your relationships and forcing you to live with your family in an uncomfortable way. Can you comment, Angela, on the generality of this experience?
Absolutely. And I think I don't want to, I'm not going to speak to specifics. You're very welcome to speak to your own specifics, but Mirabelle works in what I think we would all consider an essential worker field.
I'm an early childhood educator, yeah.
So it's the kind of job where we need people living in areas like the inner west,
Absolutely,
where we just hear constantly that we have these issues around affordability, availability not matching up with the workers that we need in those areas. So I don't think we could have a better example of how critical it is to try and ensure that we have safe, affordable, comfortable, healthy homes for
the inner west is pitched as a family-friendly area. We need people working in childcare and quality childcare at that. So
yeah, absolutely.
And so it very much was, you know, our community of renters was kind of helping Mirabelle in terms of advising on these are the sorts of options that you could take to your landlord and the kind of wording you could use. Like, this is the level it gets to. And in a sense, Mirabelle is lucky because she has access to that community and that there is a fallback option that she could live with her parents. She wouldn't be unhoused if the landlord said no. And we hear from too many renters that that isn't even an option. They don't have a fallback option, or they have children, for example. So they don't want to move out of the area they are in where the kids go to school. One of the renters in our community said to me, I was saying to her, "You're pretty stable now, right?" And she said, "Yeah." So she's been in her home for 5 years with her family. And she said, I've just had, even though it's been 5 years, I've had so many experiences of, you know, having to move every year or two that she no longer plants a garden, was her example. So her child doesn't have a garden, and they don't enjoy that. And these are the things I think we don't appreciate about inequity in terms of renting. We focus so much on affordability and, you know, but it is that quality of life dimension that I think people take for granted when they own a property. The ability to put up, you know, proper curtains that might actually fit the windows properly or go to the ceiling. It's just not there. Even if a renter wanted to spend the money and they were allowed to do that, they have no real guarantee that they'd be able to stay there long enough to enjoy it. So we certainly hear from renters, I would say very, very consistently, that they are unwilling to even challenge a rent increase. They'd rather just kind of take the $10 and figure it out and make a cut somewhere else until they get to the point where they can no longer manage it and then they have to move. So we have the situation where they're either being now lawfully evicted in most states and territories thanks to the protections against without grounds eviction, or they're getting evicted essentially by rent increase. And it doesn't have to be a huge amount to force someone out of their home because it's cumulative on top of everything else, and of course on top of all of the other cost of living increases that they're facing. Renters also have a number of other higher costs, for example when it comes to energy efficiency. We have very, very poor regulations in this country in terms of minimum standards for energy efficiency. Better Renting does a lot of work in this area. Victoria and the ACT have moved well on this. The sky, shockingly, has not fallen in Victoria, so the reforms are now coming into effect, and what we're hearing is it's actually been quite fine and not dramatic at all. New South Wales is currently consulting in terms of minimum standards for energy efficiency, but these are the kind of areas where we need national leadership. Better Renting thinks there is also a role here for the federal government to consider conditional incentives for landlords combined with strong protections for renters. Yes, so conditional incentives for landlords would be some sort of a program whereby if in a state or territory where there are good, comprehensive, mandatory minimum energy efficiency standards, a landlord might be able to access some kind of financial incentive to undertake those upgrades to the home. So the renter protection part is really critical, because what we hear from some renters, they're like, yes, I want my home to be livable and comfortable and energy efficient. I want my bills to come down. I want to be able to sleep at night, but I'm terrified that this idea of minimum standards means that my rent's going to go up, because that's what we hear all the time from the property lobby. So there is some really interesting conversations that we have with people in various parts of politics saying, oh, we can't be seen to give money to landlords. And most of the renters we speak to say we're actually quite happy for there to be some sort of fair scheme that encourages these improvements that have a range of benefits, good for emissions, good for health, good for energy bills. Energy efficiency upgrades don't have to be hugely expensive to be effective. So we're not talking about huge amounts of money for huge solar and battery schemes here. The critical part has to be that any financial incentives from taxpayer funds have to be supported by protections for renters that are stronger against eviction and rent increases. So that could look like, for example, not being able to evict the tenant for any reason other than an egregious breach of the lease within a certain period. Egregious breach. Yeah. So not the listed requirements, or some sort of very, very extenuating circumstance, in which case there might be compensation, and of course protection against rent increases during a legislated period. So you get the money, but you don't then get to double dip from the tenant.
Can I just add to that as well, as a renter, and when we were looking for properties last year, if those standards do come into play, there needs to be enforcement, especially like in my home right now. As I said, I've got tension rods with blackout blinds up. But another reason I actually have that, before we even realised the heat was an issue, is that my blinds are roller blinds. They're mouldy, they're covered in mould. And when we moved in, before we moved any of our furniture in, we did a condition report and we sent that off. We said, can we please get this professionally cleaned? Like, we're students, we don't have the money to get that professionally cleaned ourselves. And also it shouldn't be our responsibility. I'm still sleeping below mouldy blinds. So, things like that are already rules and requirements for landlords, though they're not being enforced. And I'm not going to go and fight that with the potential of being evicted or rent increases for them to come and clean it,
Thank you. You're highlighting some really important issues. I'll ask a last question, then go to the Deputy Chair, Senator Brown. You've mentioned rent increases. Do you have in mind a particular approach to rent increases that you would like to see?
Better Renting doesn't have a specific or detailed policy. What we want to see, we refer to protection against excessive rent increases. So we look at the approach in the ACT. We'll have people say it's not generous enough in terms of, or it doesn't go far enough for renters. But what we do understand is that since that policy has been introduced, that there has been downward pressure, as we like to say, on rent. So it has been effective in that sense. So that policy, for example, essentially, it's not even a rent cap, it's not even a rent limit, it's just a guideline that says this is the amount that a landlord can raise the rent by without doing a bit of work. So it's kind of reversing the onus, and that is tied to rent inflation. So it's a percentage above rent inflation. So they can still increase the rent. The renter will still have to pay more, but there is a level of certainty for the renter that it will not be these excessive hikes that we see in other.
There will not be surprises of excessive rent.
I think as well on that, when it is excessive rent and somebody can afford that, that's also adding to the intergenerational cycle I was speaking to before of families that are lifelong renters like mine are unable to provide financial support for their children to, whether that be financial support for their children to attend uni or their children to purchase a home or those kind of things, but they also don't have those financial assets that owning a home provides or owning multiple homes can provide to pass down to the next generation, which personally I think is part of the reason that this has become such an intergenerational loop and a big cycle across not just my generation, as though we might be feeling it right now quite hard. It's because it's become a cycle.
And I think it's worth also speaking very briefly to one of the kind of hidden aspects, not hidden from renters, but hidden costs of being a renter and the inequity is every time you move, it's typically a couple of $1,000s in costs. So there is, apart from the strain and the emotion, having to spend your weekends going and lining up and looking and offering more than you can afford, the financial cost alone is significant, and that is an amount of money that could be far well spent elsewhere in terms of, you know, providing for your family or meeting your own expenses.
I think as well as that, I have a coworker who just recently has had to take unpaid leave to be able to move, for 2 days of unpaid leave to be able to move because of, I don't know their specific circumstances, but I know that they are renting and they're moving into another rental. So, yeah.
I think the evidence in your submission is very clear about the personal stress and direct financial cost. Can I just ask you, as we move on, we're not hearing today from the Greater Western Sydney Advocacy Network because of ill health by their person who is going to come, but they make a lot of comment in their submission about the trade of time for money, and that it's sometimes made by people in essential jobs, that you have to often have an unexpected and onerous commute for essential workers like yourselves. How does that play out in your life, Mirabelle? Have you made decisions to stay close to your work, to avoid a commute and therefore paid higher rent? How does that trade-off work for you?
Yeah, so for me, I am quite lucky that I also work in the inner west, and for me, the two sort of key factors for staying in the inner west was remaining close to my family and remaining close to work. But I know for my housemate, she has decided, she works in the eastern suburbs, which is even worse than the inner west, and so she doesn't drive, so she travels at least an hour each way every day to work on public transport, and she had to make that choice of, you know, a better, more affordable house or commuting to work or changing her job. And, you know, well, you don't always want to change your job. If you've got somewhere that you're liking working, you want to stay there. And that's the other thing, is she works multiple jobs, and staying in the one area of the eastern suburbs during her work day makes a lot more sense.
Thank you for that. If I can go to you, Senator Brown.
Thanks, Chair. And first, can I just thank Better Renting for the advocacy work that they do for renters. You're a very powerful advocate, and I appreciate you coming along today. I did want to you touched on Victoria and the work that they do for renters, but I wondered whether you could give us what progress you're seeing from states and states on the national Better Deal for renters. Are you able to give us just a snapshot of how states are going?
Yeah, and thank you for the question, Senator Brown. I think the first thing I would note is that the Better Deal for renters wouldn't be considered to be better than what I think would be the question a lot of renters would ask. And I would just particularly note there the language is not strong when it comes to evictions in particular and minimum standards. So the Better Deal for Renters refers to minimum quality standards for rental properties, and the examples it gives are hot and cold running water. And I think the other one is a functioning stove or something along those lines. And so if that is what we're aspiring to, that is not a good baseline. I think it might be realistic, given that a renter I was speaking to last week had running water, but it was brown, and their landlord hadn't got back to them for a week. So
Can I
maybe
just
we need to
quickly-
specify
yeah,
hot and cold.
Quickly
clean.
add to that, we have hot water, but we have hot water for 10 minutes in the middle of winter, so we can't shower one after each other or have, although, you know, you're not trying to have a super long shower, you know, sometimes that's what happens, and the water turns cold and you just have to get out or brave the cold in winter.
So I think the first point from us would be we very much support a new Better Deal for Renter, and we've had some really good engagement around that that's making better renting feel positive that we might be able to see something along those lines. And there has been some good progress in other areas. I do think to the extent to which the Better Deal for Renters covers protection against unfair evictions, that's probably been the strongest area. So Western Australia recently announced that they are moving on unfair evictions, and they're basically leaving the Northern Territory alone in not taking any action. I think Tasmania's a little bit so-so on that front, but as I've said, even in the states and territories that have taken more decisive action in terms of protections against evictions without grounds, we're not necessarily seeing a huge benefit for renters, because the grounds that are allowed are quite, achievable for landlords. We also have the issue that I mentioned around rent increases forcing people out of their homes. And I think the third area that is really kind of not helping those reforms is, I've just lost my train of thought.
Needing to improve the standards for evictions, was it?
Yeah.
Standards for rentals. Minimum
No,
standards.
it is unfair eviction reforms. It might come back to me.
Absolutely understand.
I think when we look at the other areas of the Better Deal, a lot of it is kind of the language is around kind of investigating or commitments, and we just haven't seen that. The National Association of Rental Organisations, NARO, has a progress report on that they've put together, I believe, with National Shelter, that kind of it's colour coded, and there's too much red in that. And I think the key areas that we would like to see in a new Better Deal for renters would very much be further protections in terms of eviction, and very much committing to protections against excessive rent increases, and much more clarity and specificity around minimum rental quality standards, particularly energy efficiency. I think that is really the key area that we need to see that change.
Is part of that also, sorry, Ms. Cartwright, minimum length of tenancy agreements? Was that?
Not
No.
necessarily, and I will go to you in a moment, Mirabelle. We don't necessarily, better renting doesn't necessarily see longer lease terms as beneficial. Perhaps if there was a very, very minimal lease break fee, that might be helpful. What we want to see actually is a shift towards the assumption being that a renter will decide when they end their lease in most circumstances. We cover this in the Essential Homes report in detail. Again, I think it is challenging when we have so many hobby landlords in the country who are really invested just for a short-term capital gain, and hopefully this is something that will change thanks to the new reforms we have over time. But it is challenging, I think, how we progress towards that. So I think we've made the recommendation in this submission. We've made it elsewhere, but we would like a new Better Deal for renters to, and this is using that language of kind of like exploring, but very much exploring ways to enhance the eviction reforms we do have in place. So,
Yes, you do make that recommendation.
yeah.
I was just going to speak to another, I guess, loophole in eviction and like the current eviction standards, I guess. When we were looking for a home to move out last year, we found a property that had been on the market for at least a month, and decided to sign the lease along with 2 other people, and were making preparations to move within a week. And then after, I think that was on a Thursday or a Friday weekend, on the Monday, we got a call from the agent saying, oh, hi, the owners have changed their mind and they no longer want to rent. We had signed a lease, we had paid the bond, we had paid the first 2 weeks' rent. And this property had been on the market for at least a month from our knowledge. And, you know, they read our application, they obviously were okay with our application, and then gave us a call saying, hey, yeah, we don't want to rent the property anymore. So, you know, that's well within their right if they don't want to rent the property anymore, but that's still, you know, I looked into that and that's completely legal, which I think is crazy.
And Deputy Chair, I've thought of the third reason, because Mirabelle has reminded me that the unfair eviction reforms, while welcome, are not necessarily effective. And I think what we're hearing very much from renters, particularly in New South Wales and a few in Victoria, is the onus is on those renters to enforce the unfair eviction laws. And usually they've already had to leave their home and find a new home and move. And then they see that their previous home is up for rent within the exclusion period, that it shouldn't be advertised, and they're the ones who have to go to their regulator and make the case. We do, unfortunately, not hear great stories from renters about their experience at tribunals. There's a lot of room for improvement there. I think this is just really highlighting that we can only do so much, I think, with renter protections alone, and I'll keep coming back to it, but Better Renting has supported strongly the changes to the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, because we see this as part of the almost cultural shift we need to have in this country, where we are resetting the idea of renting, the idea of how we provide housing in a private market. I'm also happy to answer any questions and speak to Better Renting's strong support for greater investment in social housing, particularly government housing, and well-designed, genuinely affordable housing schemes.
Thank you, Ms. Cartwright. You mentioned in the first part of your response that you had some engagement around the next sort of stage around, and I'm hoping I haven't taken you out of context, but better deal for renters. What did you mean by that?
Well, we are an advocacy organisation. We represent renters. We have conversations with various people in various governments. That's what I mean by engagement.
Who have you been engaging with?
Sorry, who have we been engaging with? We've been engaging with the Office of the Minister for Housing, for example. We've engaged with the chair of this committee. We understand that there is interest. What we've been told is there is interest in pursuing, for example, a new better deal for renters.
Oh, okay, great.
So we hope that's the case. We'll keep pushing for it.
You're encouraging it.
Yeah.
We've had, and it's been very positive, I'm happy to say. I think there's an understanding. My sense is, and particularly from the other tenancy organisations that Better Renting works alongside, Everybody's Home that we're a member of, I think there is a sense that the first better deal was welcome. It was good to use the National Cabinet process to be able to kind of achieve that and to show that the federal government can take a leadership role in terms of this idea of nationally improving rental policies. But my sense is, from the kind of informal conversations we've had, that there's an understanding that we need to update the better deal.
Okay, that's great. Have you had an opportunity to have a look at the plan that was released by the government on Homes for Australia, a national plan?
I haven't, sorry.
That's fine. I don't want to give you homework, but if there is anything on notice, if you want to have a look at the plan, because it obviously talks about renters as well. That would be good. So I just was interested in one of your recommendations, you've talked a lot about it now, so already. So, but I'm interested. Your recommendation on the systemic drivers of housing inequity. You're looking at your recommendation on that. Is there something else that you can add to that recommendation?
As in to
just broaden it out to give more information about it.
Yeah, I think in terms of systemic drivers of housing inequity that renters face, from an Australian government perspective, the two really key areas that we see are reforming investor tax concessions and very much increasing funding for new public housing and well-designed and genuinely affordable housing. We know from research or analysis by Everybody's Home that increasing the supply of public housing and genuinely affordable alternatives not only helps the people who will be able to access those homes who are currently either unhoused, experiencing housing precarity, or really struggling to get by in the private rental market, but increasing that supply will bring down rents across the private rental market. And I think this is kind of underappreciated in the supply debate, and I will say upfront, better renting does not engage in any level of detail around conversations on supply. That is very much beyond our capacity, and there are many organisations that are better placed to speak to those policy areas. But my observation is I think those debates are sometimes pushed by the people who stand to benefit from them, for example, and it does not seem that we're achieving supply necessarily in the areas or the ways that we most need it. And from an equity systemic perspective, there is no better or more important way to improve equity than addressing the shortfall in public housing. And we absolutely commend the government for the spending increases to date, as well as the funding for improving the quality of social housing, particularly in terms of energy efficiency. There is more to do, and there are challenges around that. We would like to see perhaps some of the revenue that comes from the investor tax reforms going towards increasing funding for public housing.
And with that, I have seen a lot in terms of a lot of positives in terms of the energy efficiency sort of side of things, particularly for public housing and for owner-occupied housing. But there's a big gap for rental properties. A couple of weeks ago when the no interest loan for energy efficiency improvements was announced, I literally Googled how does this benefit renters, and there's nothing, unless our owner decides, oh yeah, that might be a good idea. But if they don't want to clean the blinds, I doubt they're going to want to implement energy efficiency minimum standards.
We'll have to get the Better Deal for Renters framework updated then.
We would love to.
Great idea, Senator.
Mm-hmm. Currently it feels like it's very much bare minimum sort of thing, and there's nowhere we can go if our properties aren't even meeting that bare minimum standard.
Yeah. I should say as well, we've had good engagement with the Assistant Minister for Climate Change around energy efficient rental homes, and I think there is just that the questions are always similar, which are around how can the Australian government have a role, what is an appropriate role, what is an equitable role, but very much within that kind of broader goal of reducing emissions while making homes healthier to live in and reducing bills for renters.
Something that we've been talking about a lot in the Better Renting volunteer community as well is the accessing the solar sharing scheme that's now a thing, but I don't even know very much about it because it's something I can't engage in because I don't even know where my energy meter is in my home, let alone if it's a smart meter, because I haven't looked around, because if it's not, I'm going to be really disappointed, and I know that there's no way that I can get it updated to a smart meter to even consider engaging in that.
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting dimensions there in equity as well around who can actually access those 3 hours and what that will most help them with. So it's welcome. It's definitely it's a good thing, but we do need to see more.
I think it's really something. The benefits for renters are very often overlooked, and there's a lot of congratulations and positivity for these things being introduced. But I think a lot of people forget that 1/3 of the Australian population who rents are just completely unable to access them.
I think the program that you're talking about is designed to be accessed, but as you say, the apartment home, you're in a complex, did you say? Mm-hmm. So, yes. Okay, so I just thank you for the evidence that you've given here today. It's been really very helpful. I just want to just confirm or not, the Better Renting, they support the Housing Australia Future Fund and the National Housing Accord?
We haven't had a huge amount of, involvement in either. Our position is very strongly that we support government housing and well-designed, genuinely affordable
social
alternatives. And I know we do hear from renters in social housing or so-called affordable housing where, for example, in the latter, if the rent is a percentage of market, that's not going to help people living in an area like Mirabel does necessarily. But also that for some people, they do not necessarily have a better experience in terms of their quote-unquote landlord or the stability in that sense, whereas historically government housing or public housing has really provided that safety net, the bedrock, the foundation for the rest of the housing system. And that is why our focus is very much in that area. And I think in the Essential Homes report, we talk a lot about the shift from the idea of everybody having a home and the historic higher investment by different levels of government in providing government housing. I know, I grew up in Sydney and there was public housing in lots of different parts of Sydney and it was sold off. At the same time, we saw this sort of almost like the privatisation of the provision of housing, not just to the private rental market, but also to, for example, community housing providers. And so this is not something that's necessarily bad, but it does need to meet the same standards that we've always expected and valued in terms of public housing, which are about providing stable housing to everybody who needs it, and making sure that where there are tenants who have challenges, where there are issues, that they are still able to be housed. And we have heard some stories that do not suggest that. So absolutely support community housing and absolutely support government investment in it, but we just want to make sure that it is being provided in a way that's consistent with what we think are the fundamental values of taxpayer-funded housing for everyone.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Cartwright, and thank you also, Ms. Summers.
Thank you, and I'll add my thanks to that also. Your evidence has been incredibly helpful to us. We will make sure we look at the Essential Homes report take that as evidence. You have drawn attention in your submission to the rental issues broadly, but also drawing attention to the fact that low-income people are particularly negatively affected in the current situation. And you've also made us, I think, very aware of the efficiency issues, the energy efficiency and the comfort questions as well as affordability of rent and predictability of rent increases. On notice, I wonder if you could do 3 things for us, which would be very helpful. First of all, you have made a number of comments about affordable renting and affordable housing, and that I would like to hear a little more about why you talk about that in the way you do, affordable housing, genuine. You say genuinely affordable. I'd like to know what's behind your using a term like that. Can you tell us a little bit about the hardship schemes and the characteristics of hardship schemes that you recommend in your final page of your submission? And I'd like to hear any detail you could offer on your view about an appropriate rent stabilisation regime. You talked about the ACT and how it gives some predictability, but are there elements that you would like to see in a rental stabilisation scheme? On notice, I'm just conscious we're very short on time now, but you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say I can take the first two on notice. I think what I've said in terms of rent stabilisation schemes would be the limit of what we would say. The Essential Homes report does speak to this. We are just not the best place in terms of speaking to. I mean, there's abundant reports from Ahuri, for example, looking at different options, and that is what we would refer to. We can provide a couple
to them, that would be useful.
Very quickly add something as well. I may be wrong, but another aspect about rent stability, our system needs to shift into renting being something that people can do for life. Not everybody has the desire to own a home. Renting can provide people with flexibility, but that shouldn't come with instability. There's lots of successful models globally of renting being a lifelong option, and I really think that's something Australia needs to look into, and that is something that's going to support rent stability.
And Mirabelle, as you say that, you've also made a strong argument for a need for a cultural shift in relation to the culture of renting in Australia for that experience to be appropriate.
100%.
Great. Thank you so much for your evidence. We're all very grateful for it. You've really added something to our role as a committee and our evidence. So we appreciate you being here in person, and we look forward to any further information you give to us, which we would like to receive within 2 weeks of you getting the transcript on Hansard. Thanks so much for all your work and being here today.
Thank you, Chair.
And now we will suspend for a cup of tea and come back at 22. Is that all right?
That's fine.
Okay. Great. Thank you.